Welcome back. This is part 2 of the pillar of creation, and this is a concept that I introduced in the last video, so if you haven't checked that out then I'll drop a little card up there for you. And I've brought some of the very similar concepts from that video to expand upon in this video. So here I have the pillar of creation. We have the chakras inside the torus field, and that's the interim, that inner channel, that open channel. And then here I have the same 2 pictures that was depicted in the last video, and I'm also going to be adding on some of Bentinho Massaro's teachings, some of the law of one again, and I'm actually going to be going back to the CIA document that was introducing the gateway process from the Monroe Institute, because I think it will really help. So I'm going to start with this section here, and this is inspired by, do you remember when you was in school and you was taught how to formulate a non-biased opinion? So we would often be taught to find all the 4 points, the points that are for, and then find all the points that are against, and then formulate your own opinion. How many of those non-biased opinions actually turned out to be biased, based off of what you thought and felt about each argument posed? And that's because it still trained you to compare for to against, based off the arguments or the data posed into that perception of for and against. So it can still formulate a very biased opinion. And these kind of structures that we're taught or encoded with over time creates our belief systems. Those belief systems are often very strong and very rigid in its perception of what it believes in. So it's very hard to find a flow state if that spatial dimension is already full up on an identity that is created from belief systems that is gathered from the external and pulled internal to attach to as a sense of self. A lot of the time self-worth is measured from the materialistic elements that one attaches to, and we often aren't taught to pull it back into that interim, to that point of measure where the self-worth is being measured into. Self-worth is being measured into the no self. That's the kind of stability of that foundation of the kind of energy source within you, or the chakra system. When that's out of balance, then you're out of harmony and you're out of sync. And just like the perception of light creates that perspective, that 3D modelling, it's the same with the belief systems. The belief systems are often energy that is stuck, or energy that's being conditioned into a point of view. And the more points that you're balancing, then the more energy that's being absorbed, and the less space that is able to filter through to that interim for that resistance to be seen by your conscious mind. When you make it conscious, then it's the consciousness that's operating that system, rather than the unconscious mind or the sense of self that's got lost in the motion. So to find the flow state, it's really about finding that no mind state, or that state that isn't creating a sense of self from its perception, and then in turn giving itself a perspective to operate within. So this section here, you can think of the 3 sides of this being the pineal, the heart, and the intuition, that all make up this space of the inner dimension. But we also have the 3 dimensions of space and 1 of time within this diagram as well. So we have the left, right, the forward, back, and the up and down, for instance, in the outward flowing of recognition of that space. But then the inner dimension is the time dimension, and that's because time is a temporal dimension that's experienced by our awareness over time. And that is what is ebbing and flowing to expand and contract within the physical vessel, that the outward experience of space is being measured into. All of that as being this. That's all experienced within this mind, body and spirit complex. But it also connects to the, as the law of one says, the social memory complex. And that's really important, and it isn't taught alongside enough spiritual teachings. And I know there's a lot out there that are pointing to these different topics, but it's more intuitive based. So just bear that in mind as we move further into this board, because it's going to get a little bit... So here we have the map of self-realisation from Bentinho Massaro, and I'll drop the link to that down below. But the first state that I want to go over is the I amness state. The very individualised self experiencing the subject object relationship and are very focused towards the experiential. We can think of that as being the person beingness, where the being is very identity based. Then next we have the I am, which is the presence beingness. That's more so focused on the permanence of what it is that remains underneath that kind of sea of motion. It's still very experience focused, but it's about focusing inwards rather than from the outwards. As that experience unfolds, you start to look into them bottom chakras and spiritual practices that focus on untangling the entanglement of the attachments that have created that identity from that person beingness. And it's still subject object focused because it's where you're finding that first self, that manifest self. And Eckhart Tolle is a brilliant spiritual teacher to help you find that I am presence state. When them bottom chakras begin to stabilise, then you're beginning to open up them heart chambers and address the fear element. So this is where that first bubble of consciousness begins to switch over to the awareness state. Don't think of these separate points as like a wall. I know it may look like that, but it's just a guidance for the spectrum of where one seemingly ends and one seemingly begins. So the I, or the awareness state, is emptiness beingness. And that's that sensation of being full of emptiness. And Moji, if you're familiar with Moji, he's a very good spiritual teacher to introduce you to this I, emptiness beingness. And this is where you're kind of learning that heart lesson and entering into the more subtler planes. So its experiencing becomes more self-experiencing. You've learned what it is to be yourself and to see others as yourself. And you've also done the inner work to truly love oneself and therefore love another as oneself, and beginning to see in unity until it becomes pure subject and no object, because you're awakening from the objectified form into the unmanifest self. And that unmanifest self is experienced as foreverness or eternity. And that's where that time dimension begins to transcend into the guidance from the beyond the I state, which is from infinity. And Bentino always uses the term the absolute to describe this, which I think is brilliant. You can also think of it as being that singularity point. Everything that we experience is being pushed out from infinity, and all of our experiences return back to infinity. And that's what we're learning from in that very paradoxical nature of that mind, body and spirit complex. So because it is a timeless realm, infinity is beyond experience, because there is no subject to have that experience anymore. You've completed the kind of octave of self-realisation and transcended it into self-enlightenment and back to self-realisation again, which is what I was touching on in that last video, where you're able to see through that sea of motion and see that it all goes back and comes out of that infinity point. And I've got some really good concepts here, and I've got some really good links in the description box that will help expand upon this concept, because I know it can sound a bit strange. So come over here. So when you think of time and space being two separate things, it's a little bit like thinking of that for and that against argument, and you aren't able to see the kind of connection that flows between them. So Dewey B. Larson's reciprocal systems theory brings that space-time element as one system that I also like to pair with the awareness. So this is really going to help to understand how space and time interlink and connect back to that space-time, because your atomic structure, the atoms and the molecules that are vibrating to create your physical form that is in the material sector, is made up of a material called matter. And that matter is not a solid form, but it enables a physical structure to be embodied. So that's the kind of magic that's making the mind, body and the spirit complex. And when you go subatomic, when you zoom as far in as you can possibly go into that material that is that matter, then you're entering into that quantum realm. Then the matter disappears and you're left with space again, because it exposes the magic trick for what it is. And you see that that atomic structure is actually made up of space. So that's what's bringing the two into that one system. And that's that seeming fourth dimension, which is very strange. It all comes back to itself in that paradoxical nature. And that's where it transcends into that love light, and you're able to kind of outward flow and teach others the wisdom that you've learned that is already always there, underneath the thinking mind and the senses, and then you're awakening to that love light element, which is kind of like the subtler planes or the guidance from infinity, bringing a further expanded awareness and kind of gridding it in from that subconscious to the conscious mind. So it's because of that structure of free will that has enabled a lot of people to take advantage of that magic trick and become the kind of magicians that are pulling the illusion over many people's eyes, because we've been trained so hard into believing that outward manifestation is reality. And we've been taken away from that inner dimension of the energetic transfer that happens underneath that material system. So there's two things going on at the same time, that paradoxal nature that always has been and that always will be. But the benefit of awakening to that magic trick is that it transcends that magic, and rather than being illusioned or delusioned by it, you're able to see its operation as it unfolds, and therefore you take your power back from that magician. And there's much more power that comes from not manipulating others with that magic trick and being able to shine light on it so that others can decipher the illusion and awaken from it, to no longer be hypnotized by it. It's like that ebb and flow from the material sector and the cosmic sector intertwining and entering into this now moment with you. So you can think of this middle bit as that one moment, that now moment. Communication is the expression of your authenticity, so it's a very powerful tool. We often don't use it or even examine it to understand its deeper connotations. So I thought I'd use love and just go over the different kind of symbolism that intuitively it can potentially lead you to understanding. So here we've got the L, and we can think of this as being many things. We can think of it as being the input and the output of that heart, the two dimensions of that service to self or service to other. But also you've got the horizontal plane or the material sector and the vertical plane or the cosmic sector. The subtler plane being that vertical, and the denser planes of the experiential being that material sector, which is also, when you zoom back in. And then we have that O, or that 0 point. That's that kind of all is one, law of one, of the wholeness that brings, that realization when you awaken to the lesson of it. Then you have this V, which is kind of, if you look at it, the two vertical. So it's like balancing them two dimensions into the seeming four dimensions, or the fourth density, which is kind of how the two communicate to each other. So you've got this point here and a point here. To move through them, you fold them, break through that to begin to bend the illusion of time and space, because you're awakening to the fact that all goes back to that 0 point that's in between. And that's how you can ascend up through higher states, using that quantum realm for your conscious awareness to rapidly accelerate your expansion by really quickly or almost instantaneously being aware of what it is that your consciousness is trying to make you aware of. And then the E being that same foundation as the L, that vertical and the horizontal, but also bringing the location of where that free will choice of where your energy can ebb and flow you between. So for instance, you've got the 1 dimension, the 2 dimension, and then the 3rd dimension in that experience, all embodying the same thing as that one system to equal that whole word. This is just the way I perceive it, but it's just a little something to think about that might help. So if we imagine that love is the intention that is contracting into light for the expansion and contraction that's experienced by our physical form, because our physical form is kind of like a projection from our non-physical form. So you know how when a baby is fertilized, there's 2 elements that make up that physical form. You can also think of it as being the Big Bang moment, where the hydrogen and the helium that create a release of a chemical that gives it a chemical body, and then in you go. So you can think of this middle bit as that one moment, that now moment, and then that process unravels, that is experienced through the system that's called time, for that kind of data transfer that your unique expression is meant to be receiving and emanating whilst within this perception of itself. Think of yourself as like a mini universe, the universe that belongs solely to you, that's inside your physical form, the map that you need to navigate through, that's been called into this reality, that is operating within a very strong frequency of duality. So it's up to the choices of the individual. So this is all intuitive. So I'm going to be going over this side a bit more in the next video and tying it in with the kind of perception of it from space-time to time-space. Thank you so much for watching, and I'm going to see you out with some Azalea and that amazing scene from Interstellar. So enjoy.
Love is the one thing we're capable of perceiving that transcends dimensions of time and space.